When the president's elected, he's elected with a vice president. And the vice president historically has just kind of waited for something to do. The vice president only has one official job, and that's they're the president of the Senate, but all that really means is they break ties. And ties are fairly rare. So the vice president is often a pretty useless position. I remember one vice president, when asked what he did for a living, he said, "I attend the funerals of foreign leaders," because he didn't do anything important, really. The power has grown over time, really going back to Bill Clinton, who gave Gore, his vice president, kind of some authority over environmental issues. The tradition lately has been for the vice president to be put in charge of some area of policy. And so, for example, Dick Cheney was put in charge of intelligence and national security type issues. Joe Biden under Obama has theoretically been in charge of jobs. And so that's kind of the new way of doing it. The vice president, I should also point out, historically had been chosen to balance out a ticket geographically. So if you had a candidate from the north, you might pick a vice president from the south, or a candidate from the east might pick one from the west. Nowadays, it tends to balance out the president in other ways. So, for example, Barack Obama was a young black guy, and so he nominated Joe Biden, who had been in the Senate since Obama was like 10, or been in the government anyway, since the Congress since Obama was like 10, and had a lot of foreign policy experience, as a way of saying, I know I don't have a lot of experience, but here I've got this vice president who does. John McCain went the other direction, being older and very experienced. He picked a young and dynamic running mate in Sarah Palin, the governor of Alaska. And so these days, vice presidents candidates pick them to shore up whatever their perceived weaknesses are. The cabinet. These are not in the Constitution. This was invented by Washington. Washington appointed 4 cabinet posts: Secretary of State, Secretary of War, it was called at the time, now it's called Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, and the Attorney General. Now there are 14 cabinet secretaries and the Attorney General. These all have to be confirmed by the Senate, and each one of these people oversees an entire department of the government. So Secretary of State oversees the entire diplomatic corps of the government. Secretary of Treasury oversees things like printing money and the Secret Service. Well, not anymore. That actually got moved out. But each one of these departments oversees a massive part of the government. Here you can see as they've all developed, although you'll see Defense, it says 1947, but in reality, the Secretary of War was one of the original ones. And you can see the growth here. Particularly if you go from like 1953 to the present, about half of them have been created in the last 60 years. But you might pause and take a look at what all the departments are. So here we have a flow chart. There's the president and the vice president. We'll talk about the White House office. And then you see all his secretaries underneath him. This is called the cabinet. Some presidents listen to their cabinet very closely. There have been presidencies historically where they let the cabinet vote, and whatever the cabinet votes, that's what the president does. There have been other presidents who ignore their cabinet. Andrew Jackson, for example, didn't like his cabinet at all and didn't pay any attention to them. He had an informal group of advisors he called his kitchen cabinet, who were his poker buddies, who were lawyers and people who ran newspapers. And he ignored his formal cabinet. Some presidents appoint people they know and they trust to serve in their administration, whether it be cabinet secretaries or staffers. Other presidents seek experts, even if they've never met them before. JFK and Bill Clinton, for example, had cabinets, and FDR had cabinets filled with experts in their field. George Bush leadership style for George W. Bush was to appoint old friends and allies. Bush argued that he needed people he could trust, people he knew he could work with, whereas FDR and JFK and Bill Clinton argued they wanted the best and the brightest at the job. I'm not saying one approach is more valid than the other, but these are two general approaches on how you fill up these offices. The executive office is made up of policy-making and advisory bodies. Well, what does that mean? There's 3 main groups. And here they are. The National Security Council, created in 1947, coordinates our intelligence and foreign policy efforts. Members include the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State and Defense, and are managed by the President's National Security Advisor. This is a Cold War position designed so we could have a unified response to the Soviets. And it still exists today, and today it largely deals with issues like terrorism. The Council of Economic Advisors is a 3-member body appointed by the President. These are economists, and they advise the President on economic policy. And the Office of Management and Budget does managerial and budgetary functions, reviewing, for example, the legislature and how the money is being spent. They do budgetary assessments of different proposals, and they also try to make sure the budgets for all the different departments make sense and they have what they need and they're not spending too much money. Chief aides and staff for the president. Some are actually more for the White House than the president. The president relies on his staff for information, but and a lot of the work is actually done by staffers. The president has the chief of staff, and he has lots and lots of people working for him. And the president really is the manager. He sets the tone. Is it going to be a type of White House like Bill Clinton had, which was kind of famous for kind of this energy and intellectual curiosity? George W. Bush seemed to have a more laid-back White House. But that is going to come from the man himself. And one day, of course, the woman. And then the First Lady. The First Lady is not an official government position, and one day there'll be a first man. But many do get involved politically. Going back to at least Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady would have some sort of initiative that she would propose. Lady Bird Johnson's was beautification, and she planted flowers all over D.C. And in fact, if you go to D.C., residents of D.C., in my experience, when I tell them I'm from Texas, will always say, "Oh, we loved Lady Bird. She made our city so much prettier. She planted cherry blossoms and flowers all over the place." And since then, First Ladies have tended to take on some sort of cause. Betty Ford was interesting. She was a recovering alcoholic, and she opened up probably the most prestigious rehab clinic in the country, the Betty Ford Clinic, and spoke openly about addiction to both drugs and alcohol and how it was a disease and these people needed help. And became a hero to many people doing it. Nancy Reagan had her Just Say No to Drugs campaign. Hillary Clinton was a little more remarkable, having been an accomplished lawyer herself, and of course now the Secretary of State. She was given the job of reforming health care. Now, she wasn't able to get the bill through, but this wasn't flowers and saying no to drugs. This was serious policy stuff. George W. Bush's wife, Laura Bush, who was very popular throughout her term, dealt with childhood literacy. And, of course, Michelle Obama has been trying to deal with childhood nutrition issues and obesity. Anyway, so here's another flow chart showing more of the offices within the government and the different staffers. And you see there's everything down here from photography to the people running the kitchen. Lots and lots of staff go into running the executive branch, just at the presidential level, the White House and that environment.